Afternoon, everyone. My name is Antonio Sorge from the Department of Anthropology and Director of the Center for Ethnography. We're thrilled to host here on the historic lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River, the Center for Ethnography's annual Distinguished Lecture. Our guest this year is Professor Pamela Downe of the University of Saskatchewan, whom it is our very great pleasure to host. Welcome to all of you here in the Catalyst Center at UTSC and the many attendees online. Many of you know Professor Downe and her work. She's a medical anthropologist with a broad range of research interests, with a particular focus on the ethnography of infectious disease. Professor Downe's scholarship explores how structural violence and colonial legacies have shaped maternal health experiences, particularly among marginalized women in Central America and Indigenous women in Canada. Her work has addressed themes of youth vulnerability, sex work, and chronic pain management in many places. She is a committed ethnographer who has done field work in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Barbados. In comparison, we are all armchair anthropologists. In Saskatchewan, her work has explored themes related to Indigenous health, motherhood, and HIV/AIDS, violence against girls and women, and more recently, as you will see, she has been thinking about the social dimensions of pandemics. Professor Downe obtained her PhD in anthropology at York University, and her dissertation focused on the experiences of marginalized women in Costa Rica and how they construct and negotiate meanings of contagion in their daily lives. Along with her early work on the cultural and medical dimensions of leishmaniasis in Mexico, this research would lay the foundation for later work on infectious disease and community-based medical anthropology. She is the author of numerous publications, including Collective Care, Indigenous Motherhood, Family, and HIV/AIDS, published in 2021, and co-editor of Gendered Intersections, an Introduction to Women's and Gender Studies. Her presentation today will focus on new material in preparation for a book titled Pandemics, Anthropological Insights, under contract with University of Toronto Press. Professor Downe has been in the faculty of the University of Saskatchewan for over 31 years and is currently Vice Dean, Faculty Relations in the College of Arts and Sciences. She's a fellow of the Society for Applied Anthropology, as well as the Canadian Anthropology Society, CASCA, and a former CASCA president and former chair of the National Medical Anthropology Network. Her research and pedagogical accomplishments have been recognized with several awards and honors. She's a recipient of CASCA's prestigious Weaver Tremblay Award, receiving that in 2011, the YWCA's Women of Distinction Award in the area of research and technology in 2020, the University of Saskatchewan's Publicly Engaged Scholarship Award, and the College of Arts and Science Distinguished Researcher Award, both in 2021, and over the course of her career has received 6 teaching awards. On a more personal note, being a graduate of York University, it turns out that Professor Downe is quite fond of Toronto. And she even disclosed to me that she is an avid fan of our local sports teams. She's an especially keen follower of the many great exploits of our indomitable team of champions, the Toronto Maple Leafs, as well as of the Toronto Raptors, whose star players always give it their best, especially after they leave us to sign with one of the big US teams. But Saskatchewan has nothing to envy Toronto when it comes to sports or anything else. It is a hotbed of curling and professional rodeo. It is a land of living skies and awe-inspiring vistas, and a football team called the Saskatchewan Roughriders, which is a really cool name. Perhaps Professor Downe's fondness for Toronto is not a surprise, as it turns out she grew up not too far from here in Kingston, Ontario, a couple of hours east of here, where she was classmates with the late, great, immortal Canadian rock star Gord Downe, lead singer of the Tragically Hip. And indeed, her photo appears right beside his in their graduating yearbook, because, well, their surnames are quite similar. Needless to say, Professor Downe is a rock star in her own right. And Pam, we are honored to have you. A warm welcome, please.
fancy microphone here. Great, good, it's working, great. Thank you very much, and thank you so much for that warm welcome, probably the best introduction I've ever had, so thank you so much for that. It's wonderful to be back in Toronto. As Anthony mentioned, I'm from the University of Saskatchewan, which is located in Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. It's wonderful to travel across the country and come to an area that I still call home. So the image I'm starting with here was generated using AI graphic software. I honestly don't remember what platform. I probably never knew, actually. And it was in the summer of 2020. And COVID-19 had, like it had so across the country, disrupted the research project that I was hoping to get underway. I was working with the Saskatoon Mothers Centre, an NGO that provides support and programming for mothers and families living in poverty. And I wanted to explore how cultural safety is understood and enacted in the context of public health fears. So COVID-19 was both serendipitously timely and incredibly disruptive to the plans that we were laying. Public health orders had closed the center's drop-in space, and I found myself on a Zoom call with the coordinator, trying to imagine how the project might be salvaged. She told me that several of the moms I had met months before were talking with their children about outbreaks and illness. And the image of a pox disease kept surfacing in their conversations. The coordinator created this image in response, and the mothers asked her to share it with me. Let's talk about this, they had apparently said. And it struck me that the visual captured something fundamental about how pandemics are remembered, imagined, and taught across generations. So I start with this because it emphasizes what we already know. Pandemics live on in memory, in children's drawings, and in metaphors and lived histories ethnographically. And we can trace those and how they take shape at different moments in this pandemic trajectory. When I was first invited to give this lecture, I thought about focusing on a single ethnographic project. But instead, I wanted to step back and trace pandemic paths more broadly. Ethnography, I will argue, allows us to explore how these paths are not linear trajectories that can be neatly modeled. They are rougher terrain, full of detours, blockages, ruptures, and unexpected continuities. And it is precisely in this terrain that we can think critically about pandemics and ethnography itself. In this paper, then, I'm talking more about ethnography than through ethnography, with the opening for deeper ethnographic engagement flagged along the way. And so, having decided on the framework, I landed here. Going viral, ethnographic journeys through outbreaks and their aftermaths. Microbes, of course, go viral. They cross species, leap borders, and spread through our bodies. But so do stories, rumors, fears, jokes, conspiracy theories, and headlines. Pandemics are lived not only in lungs and bloodstreams and hospitals, but in WhatsApp chats, families' kitchens, graffiti, and collective memory. And ethnographers, in our own way, go viral as well. We follow outbreaks across places, communities, and institutions, asking different questions at each stage. Going viral, then, is a story of pandemics and of ethnography's unique capacity to trace their biological, cultural, and political lives. And this brings me to my first point. Right, left. There we go. No worries. So what is a pandemic and why does it matter how we define it? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. A pandemic is a global epidemic, a disease that spreads widely and affects many. But once we begin to unpack this definition, right, one that has not been endorsed or recorded in any official policy, once we start to unpack this, that we'll see that things begin to unravel a bit. Who decides when an epidemic becomes a pandemic? What interests are served when a disease is granted or denied that designation? And what happens to those who live through outbreaks that are never formally declared pandemics, and yet they have been totally consuming of one's life and productivity? Instead of saying pandemic in that sort of restrictive way, I use the term pandemic field to describe an unstable terrain, the complex space where microorganisms, institutions, histories, and lived experiences intersect. The pandemic field is not just about pathogens. It is about how societies frame them, respond to them, and remember them. One way to engage this field is through pathography. Ethnographic pathographies trace assemblages of stories and practices that reveal the sociocultural effects of health crises, while epidemiological pathographies chart outbreaks across time and space. Anthropological pathographies do both. They entwine both these dimensions, showing how microbes and meanings travel together. In this presentation, I'll move through several pathographic turns, beginning with zoonotic occurrences, the ways microbes make their way into human life, suddenly, in anticipation, through narrative, or part of long-lasting ecologies. I then consider how pathogens and their stories are set in motion, moving through contexts of inequity and uneven intervention and care. And ultimately, I reflect on the residues of pandemics, what is left behind. At each stage, I highlight how ethnography challenges the presumed parameters of pandemics, showing that what appears tidy in models and data sets is far messier in people's daily lives, where uncertainty, inequality, and creativity continually reshape how pandemics are lived. My central argument is a straightforward one. Ethnographic engagements with pandemics unsettle the premise that outbreaks can never be fully predicted, modeled, or definitively known. While epidemiology identifies recurring arcs of emergence and decline, ethnography reveals how pandemics are always contingent, uneven, and entangled with histories, politics, and culture. At the same time, ethnography itself is a contingent practice, one that it demands openness to the multiple dimensions, in this case, a pandemic experience.
Pam, can I, sorry,
Sure.
we have a comment online just asking you to adjust your mic, that it's fading in and out, yeah.
There, that might be better. Let me know if that's better and I'll stop. Thanks.
Sorry.
So to begin tracing pandemic pathways ethnograpically, I want to start with zoonotic events, transmissions from animals to humans. In public imagination, these events are often narrated as sudden, spectacular biological ruptures, microbes breaking loose from their natural reservoirs to wreak havoc in human hosts. One example that has struck with me for years comes from the 2003 US outbreak of monkeypox, now called Mpox, and it's traced to Chewy, a prairie dog purchased as a pet in Wisconsin. So that's an image of a prairie dog on the far right there, an electron micrograph of the Mpox virus behind it. Chewy had been housed with Gambian giant pouched rats from Ghana, imported for the exotic pet trade. Soon after arriving in his new home, Chewy began to cough and sneeze uncontrollably. At the veterinary clinic, Chewy was nebulized with oxygen in a hamster ball. Many of you may know this, especially if you have kids who insist on having these little critters. A hamster ball is one of those clear plastic balls you put the hamster in and it will run around the room safely, right? So what the vet did was they put for Chewy in this hamster ball, thinking that providing a stream of oxygen through the vent in the ball would allow some of the infection in the lungs to clear, right? What in fact happened was Chewy started to cough and sneeze with greater intensity. What the veterinarian did not realize was that Chewy and the other prairie dogs from the Illinois holding center had already been infected with Mpox. The lesions hidden beneath their fur, so they could not diagnose them. Nebulizing Chewy in this way filled the hamster ball with aerosolized virus, creating what one microbiologist described as a pox virus bomb. So when the ball was opened to retrieve poor Chewy, the bomb effectively detonated, infecting everyone in the room and those who passed through shortly afterwards. Chewy and the other prairie dogs sadly died. And while there were no human fatalities, the outbreak sickened 79 people, 19 of whom had to be hospitalized. So what is striking here is that the outbreak was remembered as if the bomb had gone off spontaneously. The zoonotic jump condensed into a single explosive moment. But the conditions for this occurrence had been laid long before. The global wildlife trade, poor regulation of animal holding facilities, expanding demand for exotic pets. What appears as a sudden eruption is in fact the outcome of much longer histories of human-animal entanglements and political economic neglect. How's the mic, Meg? Is anybody? Is it working okay?
The mic is okay.
Okay.
When you turn your head, it
Comes in and out.
comes in and out. But they also say they can't see that the slides aren't necessarily synced, but that I don't know how to fix.
I don't know either.
And they're up here, so.
Yeah, sorry folks who are online. I'll describe it. The zoonotic slide has images of people interacting with different animals, and then there's a picture of a little prairie dog with an electron micrograph behind it. So these kinds of incidents extend well beyond the exotic pet trade. Human encroachment on forests, the commodification of animals, the expansion of industrial farming, and the circulation of people and goods all create the conditions for microorganisms to find new hosts. Just as importantly, cultural ideas about animals, about bats, pigs, poultry, or the bush, shape how zoonotic stories are told and interpreted. Zoonosis is not only a microbiological fact, it is a story that societies tell about danger, contamination, and belonging. Let's take the example of influenza. Every few years, anxieties about avian influenza return to headlines. H5N1, H7N9 are closely watched viruses by the global health authorities, not because they are currently widespread in humans, but because they could, in theory, mutate into forms that spread easily from person to person. The anticipation of a pandemic, the sense of a looming but not yet materialized catastrophe, has become one of the defining features of the pandemic field. And we see that in the aftermath of COVID-19. So what's next? What's coming next? But always preparing for that yet unknown but fully expected occurrence. As Carlo Kadaf argues, avian influenza exemplifies a politics of anticipation in which speculative futures drive present-day interventions. Frederick Keck's work on sentinel devices in Hong Kong shows how poultry markets and bird watchers become part of a surveillance assemblage where humans and animals together stand watch for the next viral jump. Nicholas Evans adds that such surveillance practices, while designed to protect, also generate stigma for farmers, market workers, and rural communities who are cast as reservoirs of risk. Avian influenza, in other words, is a zoonosis that is perpetually about to happen, a microbial event imagined and anticipated as much as it is observed. Ebola, too, demonstrates the power of zoonotic storytelling. During the 2014 to 16 West African epidemic of this hemorrhagic virus disease, many news reports focused on the idea that Ebola had jumped from fruit bats into human populations through the consumption of bushmeat. This narrative, though based on uncertain evidence, took on a powerful life of its own. Paul Richards and Sylvain Fay, among others, show that the bushmeat hypothesis cast local food practices as dangerous. It painted rural, particularly village communities, as reckless and justified intrusive public health interventions. At the same time, ethnographic work presented a contrary picture. Many local communities understood Ebola's emergence as the result of avenging ancestors, colonial extraction, environmental change, or government and international failures. Funerary practices, right, washing and touching of the bodies of the deceased, became another focal point in this story. These rituals were highly exoticized and brought under intense surveillance that linked forest villagers in Guinea with the animal host, as well as with supposedly, and this is a direct quote from the public health literature, dangerous traditions and quote unquote backward cultural practices that were framed as the root cause of contagion. As Sharon Abramowitz has shown, families themselves understand funerary care as acts of love, obligation, and dignity. Here, zoonosis becomes less a biological fact than a moral drama about who is endangering who. My own introduction to these kinds of questions came through a parasitic disease that does not usually make the headlines, leishmaniasis. As Tony mentioned, I started this work as a graduate student. I studied this protozoan infection transmitted by the bite of sandflies. In some forms, leishmaniasis can cause disfiguring skin lesions. In others, it attacks internal organs and can be fatal. My fieldwork was in southern Campeche and northern Guatemala at a time when lands once cultivated by local farmers were being sold to international conglomerates. Agricultural practices shifted dramatically, and so did the insect vectors and parasites. Conditions were created for a change from cutaneous infections, those skin lesions, long, familiar, and locally managed, to mucocutaneous infections that were doubly debilitating, especially when secondary infections took hold. So on this slide, see the red circle, the south of Campeche in Mexico and the north of Guatemala. That's where a series of 6 villages where I did this work are located. 4 on the Mexican side of the border, 2 on the Guatemalan side of the border. This was the health clinic that's sort of where I lived when I was doing this work. It was in Escárcega in Campeche. This is one of the key interlocutors in the study. All of the images of people I am showing today are with their permission. This is Ushil, one of the key interlocutors. On the right upper, you'll see the cutaneous lesion of leishmaniasis. So this is the skin lesion. It is treated locally with different sorts of very acidic juices from vegetation. Sometimes if it was particularly stubborn, they would use battery acid to cauterize the wound. And the lower image here is of an advanced mucocutaneous lesion. That's where the parasite will lodge in the mucocutaneous membranes of the body, particularly between the nasal and oral cavities, and then secondary infections would come in. So this illustrates a good chunk of what I'm going to be talking about next. For the Yucatec Maya communities represented in these 6 villages, this changing disease pattern was understood as evidence of ecological upheaval. But the severity of the change was articulated through the register of smell. The mucocutaneous lesions, they explained, carried the odor of death. One interlocutor, Ushil, stressed that this was not the fault of the infected person, but of the governments that had advanced land reforms stripping land from community control, the ejidos, for those of you who know the Central American history. So the land control was taken from the ejidos and handed to outside interests. The smell of death, embodied in disfiguring facial lesions, again that collapsed the oral and nasal cavities, was interpreted as the embodied outcome of a broader political and environmental disruption. Medicines could treat the wounds, but they could not dispel the pervasive stench that, in local theory, exacerbated illness and invited further suffering. Long before anthropologists used the term syndemic, Yucatec Maya communities articulated a theory of stench, the recognition that ecological degradation, political dispossession, and bodily decay combine to produce illness at both individual and collective levels. In this case, ethnography did more than document local knowledge. It allowed us to engage with how outbreaks are made intelligible through sensory, social, and political registers alike. Anthropologists of infectious disease remind us that these shifts, often described as an emergence, are rarely sudden. Dorothy Mull's classic work on measles in Pakistan demonstrated how structural and ecological change transformed an illness otherwise considered ordinary. Veena Das has argued that infectious disease reveals how the ordinary and the catastrophic are entwined in everyday life, even with well-known conditions such as pneumonia and influenza. Studies of neglected tropical diseases, that's a WHO term, it includes leishmaniasis, and these studies date from the early work of Marcia Inhorn and Peter Brown to the later work of Peter Hotez. These emphasize that neglected tropical diseases are diseases of poverty, hyperlocal and globally patterned, marginalized precisely because they thrive in the bodies and lives of the marginalized. My research on leishmaniasis taught me the same lesson. Zoonotic pathogens do not erupt suddenly in the human world and then retreat. They persist, adapt, and continue to shape lives within shifting ecologies of poverty, land, and livelihood. Zoonotic occurrences, then, are thresholds of meaning. They may appear as sudden accidents, looming anticipations, moral dramas, or enduring entanglements. But in all cases, they reveal the contingency of pandemic beginnings. For anthropologists, the ethnographic challenge is to trace these narratives alongside the biological events that they describe. Pathographies of zoonoses map the roots of microbes as well as the circulating stories and the logics that declare origins and assign blame. And these beginnings matter. They shape who is targeted for surveillance, whose livelihoods are disrupted, whose rituals are curtailed, and whose suffering becomes visible or remains invisible in the eyes of the world. So if zoonotic occurrences mark the crossings of microbes into human populations, the next stage of a pandemic pathography is movement. Once established in humans, pathogens and the stories they engender travel along the circuits of social life. Movement magnifies the unpredictability of pandemics. Microbes may spread silently before they are detected, while rumor, fear, and policies often race ahead, sometimes faster than the pathogen itself. I should brought this over earlier. One of the earliest times I became attuned to this ethnographically was during the 2003 SARS outbreak. At the time, I was conducting research in Barbados. That's the easterlymost island in the Caribbean, English speaking because of British colonialism, the vestiges of which are still evident in, among other things, racialized economic inequalities. Although the island never had even one confirmed case of SARS, it nonetheless, stories of it, and particularly fear of it, moved powerfully through the population, Rumors spread that tourists were concealing symptoms, that health authorities were hiding information, that the disease had somehow arrived undetected. And what struck me was not the accuracy of these claims, but the way that the fear circulated, often silently, then openly, sometimes contested, but the advocates of these rumors became even louder. SARS moved to Barbados through cultural speculation, imagination, and rumor long before the virus ever could. As Charles Briggs and Clara Mantini Briggs argue in their study of cholera in Venezuela, stories of contagion travel fast, shaping where outbreaks are believed to be and how people act in response. SARS in Barbados proved this point. Pandemics are experienced sometimes as the very first step through rumor, narrative, and the politics of credibility. So as I was focusing on the way that fear was circulating during SARS, I was also interested in another kind of movement, the mobility of women involved in migrant sex work. Migrant sex work takes many forms. The minority of it is coerced. However, that was the case for the 12 young women who participated in the project I was conducting at the time. 7 of these young women were from the Caribbean region, 1 from Venezuela, 3 from the United States, and 2 from Canada. They spoke about Barbados with a complicated affection. They loved that mobility was reflected in the very architecture of the communities where they stayed, where local people often welcomed them. Many of them were housed in chattel houses, represented here on the slide. These are small wooden homes built to be easily dismantled and moved from one plot of land to another. Emerging in the plantation era of the late 19th century after emancipation, chattel houses reflected both precarity and resilience. Property laws prevented formerly enslaved people from owning the land on which they lived, but these movable houses allowed them to maintain autonomy and community despite their insecure tenure. For the women I worked with, these houses symbolize both transience and a kind of belonging, a space of precarious welcome. Because HIV/AIDS was dominating the headlines throughout the Caribbean as centrally as SARS was in the early 2000s, sex workers were highly stigmatized. Migrant women involved in commercialized sex were often portrayed particularly intensely as vectors of HIV, their mobility linked to danger and disease. Yet interlocutors' own narratives, once again, told a very different story. The young women told stories of seeking economic survival, of navigating restrictive immigration regimes, and finding ways to care for children and kin across borders. The women's most pressing health needs, as they represented them to me, were the physical effects of opioid addiction, untreated injuries, and daily pain. However, they often identified as needing HIV services because HIV was the most reliable entry point to the resources that they needed: painkillers, food, shelter, and centrally, counseling. In our post-counseling discussions, these sort of open-ended interviews, where participants would debrief with me what they had talked about with the social worker, they created collages that depicted how they saw themselves in the world: highly mobile, sexualized, and without a stable home. They spoke enviously of local sex workers and other migrants who seemed to enjoy greater agency and stability in their lives, whereas the world around them was increasingly panicking about the HIV/AIDS pandemic, framing it justifiably as the crisis of the age. For these young women, HIV was a backdrop. Their immediate crises were addiction, injury, and dislocation. HIV mattered less as a virus than as a passport to survival resources. Ethnographic techniques, those interviewing, the identity collages, which I apologize, the pictures aren't great. I didn't have access to my faculty office where I had the original of these collages, so I just took a photo of these from a publication. These collages that they put together from pamphlets, magazines, other kinds of things that they were able to access largely through the HIV services that they were accessing in order to get painkillers and the medical attention that they wanted. This constellation of ethnographic techniques allowed us, the research team, but particularly me, to see the misalignment between the global narratives of pandemic emergency and the lived experiences of those most vulnerable. As Cindy Patent and Vin Kim Nguyen have shown, the circulation of HIV was and remains entangled with the circulation of people, ideas, and stigma. To trace HIV's movement ethnographically is to see not only how a virus spreads, but how inequalities of gender, race, and class shape who is blamed for that spread. So the Barbados research, from SARS fears to HIV discourses, unsettles the idea that pandemics are only, or even primarily, about those who are infected. They certainly are that, but they also unfold across the pandemic field, where bodies, stories, and fears are enfolded into the social life of contagion, drawing in communities far beyond those who test positive. Movement shows that pandemics in all their dimensions travel widely, but they do not land unevenly, or they do not land evenly. Pandemics take root where inequality has already prepared the ground. Poverty, overcrowding, and inadequate infrastructure create fertile conditions for transmission. This is not accidental. It is the outcome of structural violence, as the well-known work by Paul Farmer and Nancy Shepherd-Hughes has long shown. This recognition provided the starting point for my study of how Indigenous communities in Saskatchewan were affected by the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Rates of infection are far higher in Saskatchewan than in other parts of Canada. When I was doing this research in 2008 to 2013, and then it was extended beyond that even further, Saskatchewan had rates that were 3 times that of the national average. It went down to 1.8 times the national rate, and we're back up now to 3.5 times the national rate. And is disproportionately affecting Indigenous people and increasingly Indigenous women of childbearing age. But to speak of this only in epidemiological terms would be to miss the point. I was able to partner with AIDS Saskatoon, the primary HIV service provider to central and northern Saskatchewan, and I adopted ethnographic participatory methodologies that involved open-ended interviews, narrative interviews, program access interviews, participant observation, sharing meals that were provided by AIDS Saskatoon, working alongside the staff, as well as photo voice techniques, where I gave cameras to participants and asked them to take photographs of the people, places, and things that best reflected what it means to be an Indigenous person, family member, in the context of this HIV/AIDS pandemic. It became clear through the participant stories, often haltingly told, that HIV was, among other things, part of what the Cree participants called Missenowin, or losing everything. This is best illustrated in an interview that I conducted with Francine, one of the key interlocutors here. So there's a photo of Francine, and here is AIDS Saskatoon, the yard and the flags represented here. These are prayer flags representing everyone who accessed the services of AIDS Saskatoon who died during the duration of this. So when I asked Francine, how would you describe HIV/AIDS? She responded with an extended illness narrative. Through careful employment, Francine situated HIV/AIDS within a life course of loss and survival. She began with her brother's death some 56 years earlier. Both Francine and her brother had contracted polio as children. The virus had paralyzed her brother's diaphragm, and according to Francine, he had just suffered from tuberculosis. His little body could not withstand another infection, and he died in his mother's arms. Francine survived, but her legs were paralyzed. As she relied on crutches a neighbor fashioned for her. At the age of 10, she was forcibly removed to a residential school. I lost everything, she told me. They took my crutches away and gave me different ones that didn't fit. I lost my ability to move. I lost my mother and my aunties. I lost my own clothes, my language, my friends, my dogs. I lost everything. From there, she narrated a trajectory marked by illness, abuse, racism, housing insecurity, addiction, and repeated trauma, including the gonorrhea infection that marked her entry into adulthood and the 4 difficult pregnancies that followed, as well as HIV/AIDS and hepatitis C diagnoses in middle age. After nearly 3 hours of conversation, she closed her story by circling back to my original question. You asked me to describe HIV/AIDS. It's a virus that destroys my immune system, but it is really part of miscenuine, which means losing your whole family, losing everything. In the Plains Cree language, miscenuine was likely first used to describe smallpox and its devastating toll on Indigenous communities. In many oral histories, smallpox is remembered not just as a disease, but as a symbol of colonial violence and cultural devastation. The word miscenuine has endured and has been expanded, not only by Francine, but almost all the Indigenous participants in the AIDS Saskatoon project. It's a way of describing the far-reaching imprints of colonialism, including HIV/AIDS. Francine's story was made available to me only because ethnography is contingent on trust that is established after long periods of rapport. It's contingent on cultural safety, where people feel comfortable sharing the words that mean and best reflect their experiences. Francine's story demonstrates how pandemics are lived as accumulations of loss, violence, and resilience, refracted through histories that epidemiology alone cannot capture. Tuberculosis, sometimes called the slow pandemic, further illustrates this dynamic. TB thrives in contexts of poverty, malnutrition, and overcrowding. It has long been treated as if it were an individual pathology, a matter of adherence, compliance, or default, when in fact it reflects structural conditions of inequity. Meryl Singer's work on syndemics shows how tuberculosis interacts with HIV, poverty, and substance use, creating not a single disease trajectory, but all of these sort of overlapping crises. In Canada, TB continues to disproportionately affect Indigenous and Inuit communities, a direct legacy of colonial housing, diet, and medical neglect. Ethnography reveals how TB is woven into the fabric of daily life, the stigma of coughing, the surveillance of public health visits, the isolation of sanatoria. But here too, our access as anthropologists is shaped by history. Researchers' presence in Indigenous communities carries its own colonial baggage, and what is said and unsaid to us reflects that history. To speak of ethnography's contingency then is to acknowledge that our insights are not neutral extractions, but co-productions, right, established through context. When we talk about inequality, we are also talking about the conditions under which ethnography itself becomes possible. Just as pathogens cluster unevenly, so too does knowledge. Some stories are amplified, others remain silenced. Anthropology's role is not to claim full knowledge, but to insist on attending to the fractures that prediction and models smooth over. Given the prevailing inequalities, we can therefore conclude that pandemics are not great equalizers, as politicians throughout history RFK most recently, have consistently claimed. They are amplifiers of existing fault lines, and they remind us too that ethnography is not omniscient. It sees only what our relationships and positionalities allow. But in its very contingency lies its strength, because it is through careful, situated engagement that ethnographers lay bare the fractures, silences, and uneven terrains that make pandemics what they are. If pandemics magnify inequity, they also reconfigure the way care is practiced. Outbreaks generate interventions designed to control, contain, and cure, right? That's the whole point of public health interventions. They also transform intimate routines of caregiving. One way to think about this ethnographically is through the home-hospital-home trajectory. In many pandemics, care begins at home with kin, neighbors, or community workers. It then moves into institutional spaces of hospitals and then returns to home again, often in altered form. This movement between home and hospital is not linear or seamless. It is marked by tension, negotiation, and unrelenting emotional labor. Consider HIV/AIDS again. In the early years of the pandemic, when biomedical treatments were scarce, care was overwhelmingly home-based. Families, and often women and children, bore the work of feeding, bathing, and comforting the sick. Later, hospitals and clinics became central as testing, antiretrovirals, and palliative care expanded. But stigma often followed the patients into those institutions. The cycle then moved back home, where community organizations like AIDS Saskatoon mobilized collective care and accompaniment, linking biomedical treatment with kinship and cultural idioms such as Meshenowin. For many participants in the AIDS Saskatoon project, HIV was understood as a collective obligation that extended well beyond the nuclear household. And here are 3 photos. This is Francine's home in Saskatoon, a rental house that was never fitted with the ramp that she was always promised. And so she would rely on neighbors, family members, and friends to physically lift her in and out of her home. St. Paul's Hospital is the primary institutional site for HIV care in Saskatoon. And then this is the drop-in center of AIDS Saskatoon, which really functions in very much a family-like setting. There are computers, there's living room furniture, there's a TV where people would argue over what to watch, what not to watch, where there would be magazines and so on lying around. Washers and dryers were available. Showers were available, coffee was always on, food was provided. The kind of care embraced by the Indigenous women with whom I worked stood in stark contrast to the expectations of intensive motherhood in Euro-Western contexts. And intensive motherhood or intensive parenting really focuses on that parent-child dyad to the exclusion of other care structures. And it's most often the mother-child, mother-offspring dyad. In Indigenous communities, care was much more expansive and cooperative. Aunties, cousins, grandparents, neighbors, and even children themselves participated in providing nurturance, support, and upkeep. This collective kin-based care created networks of survivance, as Gerald Visner calls it, that ensured cultural safety and continuity. It also resisted the isolating effects of biomedical institutions and limited access treatments, particularly addictions treatments such as methadone programs. And these programs often over-individualize the treatment itself, setting responsibility for illness and recovery to the person, not the family, not the broader network. In the long run, the collective care was not only more sustainable, but it was actually more effective in supporting both health and cultural survival. Again, tuberculosis represents the very same dynamic. For much of the 20th century, patients were moved from homes into sanatoria, often forcibly, and frequently for years, and then discharged back into households ill-prepared to manage their needs. More recently, DOTS programs, that's directly observed therapy short course, shifts the responsibility back to patients and families, reframing care as surveillance. Treatment adherence is absolutely central to DOT's success. Treatment adherence, though, is also often represented as non-compliance. And yet, as ethnographers like Jean Hunliffe has shown, there are many, many reasons why treatment might be disrupted, including in many parts of the world, there's simply inconsistent treatment supplies or pharmaceutical supplies. And yet it's often described and recorded as a lack of compliance. In these cases, what counts as care then is shaped by both biomedical priorities and family capacities and functions as surveillance. What institutions present as protection, families may experience as intrusion. A hospital can be a place of healing, but it can also be a site of stigma and harm. And just as care moves between home and hospital, so too do skepticism, suspicion, and resistance. What is offered as cure can be reinterpreted as control, a dynamic that has recurred across pandemics, from cholera to COVID-19. I'm sure that this scenario will sound familiar. In the midst of an outbreak, people refused quarantines, resisted compulsory hospitalization, and spread rumors that doctors were deliberately infecting the poor. Hospitals were said to be places of certain death, and officials complained that wingy conspiracy theories circulated faster than the pathogen itself. This certainly sounds like COVID-19 in parts of Canada, definitely Saskatchewan. But in fact, these descriptions come from cholera epidemics in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Communities described as ignorant or unruly were in reality responding to long histories of neglect and abuse at the hands of authorities. These dynamics reappeared in the late 20th century Latin America. In Venezuela, Charles Briggs and Clara Mantini Briggs, who I mentioned earlier, documented how the cholera outbreak in the early 1990s became racialized, with regional and global public health officials accusing indigenous Wareo mothers of incompetence, portraying them as incapable of understanding basic hygiene, clinging to backwards cultural ways. This racist caricature was not supported by Briggs and Mantini Briggs's ethnography. Mothers and indeed entire families took great care with food preparation and cleanliness. So when confronted with the official narratives that pathologized their communities, Wareo people produced counter explanations for the outbreak. Some argued that cholera had not emerged organically, but had been introduced through contaminated ships that were knowingly quarantined near the tributaries of the Orinoco River, the water source of the Wareo villages, represented from Briggs and Mantini Briggs's work, shown here. Others offered more expansive theories that the Venezuelan government was spreading US engineered superbacteria developed for use in the Persian Gulf War at the time, deliberately targeting the Delta region where they lived. And these conspiracy theories, while outlandish on one level, can also be read as rational responses to the violence of structural neglect, grounded in long histories of racialization and state abandonment. When the mothers who were blamed for the outbreak argued that the government itself was spreading cholera, they were articulating truths about inequality and power. A similar pattern unfolded in Haiti almost 2 decades later. After the 2010 earthquake, cholera was introduced by United Nations peacekeepers, yet responsibility was denied and blame shifted onto the Haitian communities themselves. The Haitian government's response was constrained by deep dependence on international actors, NGOs, foreign aid agencies, and the UN itself, as well as the chaos of the earthquake's aftermath. The result was an epidemic that expanded over the next 2 years and became a widespread and endemic threat for the next decade. While reported cases declined, there were localized surges during rainy seasons, right? And this would reignite public anxiety and public anger. The anger grew at the slow response to the epidemic, as well as the ongoing presence of the UN troops, and that anger turned into outrage. In the port city of Saint Marc, a newly established cholera treatment center set up by Médecins Sans Frontières was set on fire by local residents who feared that these humanitarian workers, like the UN troops, were spreading the disease. In the historic northern city of Cap-Haïtien, demonstrators gathered to publicly condemn the UN peacekeepers for causing the outbreak. The protest turned violent. Demonstrators attacked police stations, public health clinics. The city was finally put on lockdown for 2 days. And when it reopened, graffiti covered the city walls. UN equals cholera, the graffiti read. Similar graffiti and public demonstrations of anger were in Port-au-Prince, and this is just a CBC image of the kind of graffiti and outbursts that were occurring then. So these cases are examples from cholera, and we could add many more. We see similar kinds of contestation around Ebola, TB, polio, certainly HIV/AIDS, illustrate how interventions are entangled with histories of harm and mistrust. Ethnography unsettles the tidy distinction between adherence and resistance, showing instead a spectrum of responses, right, shaped by memory, concern, inequality, and context. So what remains once the emergency is declared over? What lingers in bodies, families, institutions, and memories? The residue of pandemics are the uneven traces that they leave behind. Residues may take the form of chronic illness, long-term disability, deepened inequalities, those stories and silences and collective memories, right? All the things that stay with us. To study residues ethnographically is to see that pandemics do not end when governments or the WHO say that they do. They end unevenly, partially, or not at all. And their effects persist in ways that official narratives often seek to erase. Public discourse often invokes the idea of pandemic amnesia, the notion that societies forget pandemics once they subside. Pandemic amnesia is now a widely used term, circulates, as I show here, on the United Nations website, circulates in WHO literature. Let's take the 1918 influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu. For decades, this pandemic was said to have been forgotten, overshadowed by the First World War. There's a PBS documentary called Influenza 1918. I use it in my undergraduate course on infectious diseases. A lot of people use it. It is actually a great documentary on the flu, but there is one in its final segment. The overvoice says, as soon as the dying stopped, the forgetting began. In that same segment, historian Alfred Crosby reflects, influenza is not in our collective memory. That is the greatest mystery. How could we have forgotten anything so horrendous, so massively horrendous as this? My question, though, is it truly amnesia or is it erasure? When I was working at Saskatoon during the H1N1 pandemic of 2009, and there were a lot of comparisons being drawn between the 2009 influenza pandemic and 1918. In many ways, 1918 is a template pandemic. It's a common comparator to pandemics throughout the world. So when I was at Saskatoon at that time, several participants began without prompting to recount stories passed down from their parents or grandparents about the 1918 flu. My grandmother lost 2 sisters in the flu. One man claimed, Mom told me that her great uncle was never the same after 1919, said another woman. These memories shared aloud in the drop-in center and then elaborated further, painted a vivid picture. There were shuttered stores, food deliveries, widespread deaths. They spoke not of forgetting, but of remembering in private, in family stories passed down across generations. The issue was not an absence of memory, but absence of recognition. These were pandemic recollections without platforms. So what is often described as amnesia may be erasure, an outcome of narrative control, because erasure is, of course, political, and therefore it determines whose suffering is publicly remembered. An ethnography, the systematic recording of local logics, dynamics, attention to whispers and silences, documents residues that official accounts suppress. AIDS offers another perspective. In Canada, as in many parts of the world, the initial public panic of the 1980s gave way to the normalization of the epidemic as a chronic disease managed by antiretrovirals. Yet ethnographically, we see that the residue is much wider than that. For Indigenous women in Saskatchewan, as I have explained here, HIV is inseparable from loss, colonial violence, fractured kinship, and intergenerational trauma. For queer communities in North America, the residue is activism, grief, and an insistence on memory, exemplified by the slogan, silence equals death. To describe such legacies or to erase such legacies as amnesia is to miss the point. These residues are not forgotten. They are actively contested, remembered, and reworked in ways that resist erasure. COVID-19 makes residues visible on a global scale. Long COVID, with its unpredictable and debilitating symptoms, has left millions of people disabled, often without recognition or support. Women who carry the disproportionate burden of care during work from home and lockdowns describe exhaustion and burnout that continue years later. Nursing home residents died in large numbers, often alone, leaving families with unresolved grief. Essential workers carry memories of risk and abandonment, while some communities continue to face stigma and racism tied to the early days of the pandemic. And I'm thinking particularly of Chinese wet market workers. Yet much of this is being erased in the rush to declare COVID over. Headlines proclaim a return to normalcy, and here too, what looks like amnesia is better understood as erasure, the deliberate sidelining of inconvenient memories in order to restore a sense of political and economic stability. Residues, then, are part of the pandemic field itself. To focus only on the dramatic onset and acute crisis misses the long tail of suffering, resilience, and contestation that follows. Ethnographies make residues visible. But there is more to it than visibility. Ethnography also critiques erasure itself, asking why certain memories are amplified and others suppressed, and insisting that residues be recognized as central, not peripheral, to the experience of pandemics. Pathographies map not only the roots of microbes, but also the assemblages of experiences, stories, fears, resistance, and memories. By working through zoonotic occurrences, movement, inequity, care, and residue, we see that pandemics are complex, contingent fields of experience. They are lived and remembered unevenly, and it is precisely this messiness to which ethnography is attuned. What then of ethnography's own future? Ethnography is renewing itself to the task. Multi-sided work, though not new, but intensifying, follows people, practices, and pathogens across locales. Multi-temporal fieldwork, such as Xiao Biel and Adriana Petrina, returns repeatedly to trace those long tails of residue. Sensory approaches attend to smell, touch, sound, and feeling as legitimate knowledge, the stench of death. And multi-species ethnography insists that humans, animals, and microbes are entangled in ecological and political ways. Together, these methods expand what pathography can capture. So what does this demand of us? First, a refusal of tidy models that erase the messy realities of everyday life. This requires a commitment to document residues and contest erasures, to make visible the suffering, care, and memory that official accounts too often overlook. Pathography gives us the analytical tools to do this, to connect microbes with meanings and to hold open the complex, ethically urgent stories that pandemics leave behind. And second, it requires of us a commitment to experimentation and renewal. Digital technologies extend our reach, enabling us to follow conversations, rumors, and mobilizations that travel across platforms and geographies simultaneously. In the pandemic field, this allows us to map not only how a virus spreads, but how hashtags, memes, TikTok clips, and WhatsApp threads become carriers of their own kind of contagion. But at the same time, the core of ethnography remains unchanged: connection and listening. These are what allow Francine's illness narrative and Ushil's theory of stench to be heard, not as marginalized voices, but as analytical insights that reframe how pandemics are understood. Thank you very much.